Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
It's very nice to be here. Congratulations to Cathay on your 10th anniversary of this forum. We also have an anniversary of sorts. Today is the 15th anniversary of AVPN since our founding back in 2011. And so I'm glad that, as we launch our forward-looking strategy, I'm here today sharing our insights with this group. Just to give a sense, in Asia, at least there's 26 trillion financing need to meet our social and development goals. And this goal cannot be met by capital alone. And this is where AVPN comes in. We are a network. We are a non-profit organization. We have members all across the world trying to deploy capital into Asia. And our goal is essentially, how do you make it as seamless as possible? And the reason why this needs to be Asia-led is because while the gap is huge, the growth in wealth is also quite huge in Asia, right? And we saw, I think in the morning when I was looking at the deep capital markets, 5 of those are in Asia. And we've seen consistently how Asian organizations are actually leading the way. However, the enabling environment, which is the ecosystem, that connective tissue, that's missing. And here is where we then come in with our approach, which is bringing these ecosystem actors together across philanthropy, impact investing, and blended finance to then help create the frameworks necessary. And again, in the morning, I think our Japanese colleague was saying that we import a lot of the frameworks from the North. So one of our key goals is how do we set Asian frameworks for the things that we want to achieve, and how do we influence the capital to move effectively? I'm here representing some of our work in the climate space, but as an organization, AVPN has been focused across all the sustainable development goals. Today, particularly, I want to talk to you about the people-centric aspect of energy transition. And this is going to be a little different, right? I'm not going to speak too much about megawatts and gigatons of carbon. I'm going to talk about what are we doing this for, right? And this is to center it around people. The whole aspect of energy transition has been somehow very infrastructure-centric, right? And while we are running towards deploying capital into these infrastructure, we have forgotten a little bit of the why. And that's why what you will see here today is a bit of a framework for how do you look at equitably moving this transition forward. And why is this important, right? This is because both the scale of the climate risk and the urgency of what's happening across the world is quite clear, right? And this is why we built this platform. And as Sophia mentioned, they came in as our anchor sponsor, 2 years ago, and we've been building this to make sure that it's not going to be led by a single entity. And we make this as a platform so that different kind of actors will come together to then adopt this people-centric approach and be able to deploy and also measure outcomes effectively. So we set ourselves 3 goals. First, of course, is what is this people-centric approach? How do we bring some clarity into that? And the second is to say, how do we therefore influence how capital moves into these approaches? And finally, how do we ensure that the supply side, which is the delivery and the capacity of the implementing organization and the operators, that's also matching the requirements from the capital side. So today, I'm going to cover 4 things to why this matters, what does good look like, how do you measure that, and then how do we move forward, right? These are the 4 things that we will do, and I'll try to bring this in from the perspective of both project operators, but also asset owners and ecosystem actors, right? So let's start with what's the situation today. And you will see that we are on a trajectory to 2.7. We're at around a 1.3 mark now. And it's only growing. And it's not just Taiwan. I think more and more countries, 6 of the top 10 vulnerable countries to climate disasters are in Asia, right? And this is increasing. And this has real social, but also economic impacts. And this is where I think being people-centric is important. And you'll see that, when we look at the share of emissions, we are half the emissions. But when we look at the number of countries that are actually having the capital to address it, that's actually much lesser. This creates the problem. And so immediately, capital will start moving towards the cream, which is the clear parts, the visible parts, the tangible parts, and it forgets the operating layer underneath, right? But if you look at the opportunity, there is a huge opportunity. I think for the first time in the global economy, investment in renewables actually increased, was more than the investment in fossil fuels, right? About 1.2 trillion, if I'm not mistaken. And you look at Asia, the population of youth that we have is also another tremendous opportunity. Creation of these new industries, this transition must also take that into account, that we are creating new jobs and new skills and new livelihoods. But when you look at how capital has moved, as I have said, even the most progressive things such as the JETP frameworks, they were still focused on the infrastructure. There was no importance given to the people-centric side, and it was almost as an afterthought. And you can see the effect, right? And many funders, many investors, they all think that the transition means you put the infrastructure and things work, and it doesn't. And why does it not work? Because the people who are affected by it, they are not being part of the process. And therefore, it's not just a risk mitigation mechanism. It's like, this is the only way the transition will last. And if we are looking at lasting change, it's quite critical that we then take a hard look at who are the people affected by the transition and how are we ensuring that all of these are coming along in the process. So in that, we have identified these 4 segments of stakeholder groups, right? And each of these stakeholder groups have different challenges, they have different roles to play, and they are affected in different ways. But it's very clear that when we look at the transition, if we ignore these segments, and I think in the morning, I think one of the gentlemen were also saying that we need to look at the SMEs. The big ones, they can figure it out, but it's the SMEs where the bulk of the value chain resides, the bulk of the scope 3 emission resides, that's completely out of the picture, right? And then we wonder why there is pushback, right? Projects that have been approved by governments stall because there is activism on the streets. People are refusing to accept these projects. And we see even these new projects that are coming up, people are now much more aware and they are worried about the effect it will have on their environments, on the quality of life, the air they breathe, the water they have to drink. And hence, what we need to now look is to say, if we are able to prioritize these stakeholders and ensure that not just the cost, but also the benefit needs to be equitably deployed to these 2 stakeholder groups. So while we are talking about it, I don't want to just make this as an aspirational language. There's real operational content here. Like, what are the metrics that will help us understand whether this has been achieved or not? And so this is meant to guide both the project developers, but also the asset owners. Both groups need to be talking to each other about this. And so we have come up with a set of 4 principles, but also a set of metrics, both at an output level and an outcome level, that will then guide these asset owners to say, are these the questions you're asking? And for the asset managers and the project developers to say, are we really able to answer these questions honestly, right? So the first principle is whether there is actual tangible impact beyond the energy itself being produced. Like, how are we actually creating this as a way to improve the social and economic outcomes of stakeholders in that country? The second is engagement and empowerment. How inclusive has this process been? When these large-scale infrastructure projects are set up, are we consulting these stakeholders involved? And are we doing it with more than a tokenistic approach, right? And equity and fairness, this is about who benefits from these processes. There are so many examples where, large-scale solar farms come up on agricultural farms, and then these farmers are actually out of farming land. Or large-scale farms coming up in the deserts of Rajasthan, and then the local pastoral people are being evicted because now their pastoral land is considered as wasteland and therefore being considered for solar power projects. So, and they are not benefiting from this. They still sit there 200 meters away from the power plant with zero power. And finally, the transparency and accountability, which is, as project owners and developers, can we document what we are doing step by step and report on these metrics? And while we may not be perfect in all of them, the idea is that we need to start moving towards the aspirational level, right? And so how do we translate these principles? So there are 3 levels. The first is to say, does your project actually fulfill the basic principle? The second is has it fulfilled, or at least does it partially fulfill the principle? And finally, is it paying due respect to the intention behind the principle, right? And so this is meant as a diagnostic. It's not a judgment. It's not a verdict on the project, but the idea is that using this as a start, the governance of these projects can be improved, and the investment theses can take these into account as assets are being created. And now, how do we measure these? And bear with me, this is going to be the densest slide in this presentation. So each of these communities, there are certain risks. So when we look at workers, there is, of course, a huge upskilling and reskilling component. And when we look at communities, the idea of creating new livelihoods, but also how communities are being compensated in the process of acquisition. And finally, in consumers, whether this power is actually affordable, and SMEs in terms of how they are whether they're getting the capacity building required to be able to go through the transition. And so what you see here is from a set of interviews that we have done over the last year and a half, where we have identified some solutions. These solutions have come from national government plans as well as private sector, stalwarts who are actually building these upfront into their projects, right? And you look at the sample metrics that tells you the kind of metrics that you can use as a measure of success. Where is your project and how is it moving? And these, as you can see, I'm not talking about the energy produced, and I'm not talking about the carbon emissions at all. I'm purely focusing on the people-centric component. It is a given that your project, your clean energy project, will be creating power. That's the basic mandate. It is a given that by using this, you're not actually replacing emissions, but you're actually reducing emissions. But in the process, are we ensuring that the communities that are being affected are also being addressed equitably? So that's the goal. Now, let's say the metrics are clear. So we know what these are and whether these are, whether we know we are getting there or not. What's next, right? What we would like to do is to help people think this in terms of aspiration. Now that I am at stage A, how do I move towards stage B? And so what I did was bring a couple of examples. A couple of months ago, there was the first ever Climate Action Week in Mumbai, and it was quite inspirational to see different countries. Last year, Bangkok also reactivated Climate Week. This year, they're making it bigger. So across Asia, we are seeing this momentum, right? It's not just held in the realms of New York and in London, but actually in Asia. And so that's why I'm happy that even Cathay, this forum is actually happening within Asia, because this is where the action is going to be. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and each of these examples, what I will do is to give you a sense of how do these case studies fare against those 4 principles and why they still make business sense. But first of all, what I want to do is to kind of challenge a myth that we think that all of this is charity, all of this is concessional. It is not. So if you look at some of these metrics here, the risk of default goes down when you install energy efficiency in homes. The returns go up when you look at green industrial properties, right? Operating costs on buildings, both embodied as well as operational emissions, increases the return on those assets. So all of these are saying that there is a real economic opportunity. 1 minute. You're sure that this is correct, right? There is a real economic opportunity here. I think the chairman also mentioned it. We have to move away from risk language to a language of opportunity. And here is one example from Mumbai that I was seeing, that farmers in general, they burn the waste. But if you take that waste and convert it into biochar and then you reapply it back to the soil fertility goes up, the farmer gets an income through the biochar, and at the same time, you're actually reducing emissions. This is a fantastic example, but what happens is that most of these farmers, they don't have the wherewithal to be able to do all of this. And it requires large-scale investment in the capex for these industrial pyrolysis plants. Now, what the government is doing is very interesting, because what they're doing is to give these organizations a purchasing power mandate. And so through that process, there's a guaranteed income, and which makes the investment case better, because no bank is interested in setting up one plant. They want to look at thousands of plants, right? So this is one example. And similarly, if you look at electric buses, and this is a big area, unfortunately, no country has ever figured out public transport sustainably, right? Economically, most governments, it's a loss-making process. But if you look at bringing in private sector actors in terms of the electrification needs that we want to do, when it starts making sense is when there is an aggregator and when there is a payment security mechanism. So these are all innovative models that they're coming up with, where instead of looking at just 1,500 electric buses, we are looking at the entire mandate of 15,000 buses and saying, if we bundle it together, then it makes sense. If you separate them in different cities, it may not make sense. But when you bundle it, then the operators get interested, and the first bid was won just 2 weeks ago. And for those bids, grids, then we need the investment, right? And this is where there's a 12-year concession. The government is coming up with payment security mechanisms so that if there is a loss, if there is a delay in the payments, then the state government, the federal government steps in to pay the operators. These are all great examples where I have more examples on this front, but I'll just skip to the last part. I'm happy to share all of these with you after this, but you will see that each of these examples, we have actually mapped them against the principles and to say, does this make sense? What can we do to improve these projects to be more people-centric in nature? Now, finally, again, like I said, it's a group effort. It's a team sport. We all have a role to play, not just the capital side, but also the philanthropies, but also the regulators, as well as the industry standard-setting organizations, right? Now, I see Taiwan as a great opportunity for us to be able to influence, how this capital can be deployed. There is lots of capital available within Asia. If we are looking at Asia now, the technology is also not the problem. Lots of innovations have come up. It is about translating it. Rebecca mentioned it in the morning. It's about moving from ambition into action, right? Like, how do you actually deliver? Secondly, we need to look at the resilience of these assets. There's no point building an asset that is going to be washed away or destroyed by the next weather event. So we need to look at long-term transition, and therefore we need to look at long-term resilience. That's the only way we win this game. And finally, we have to, and Sophia gives this advice, you have to make the projects are investable from day one. Don't try to create something, call it a pilot, and then go looking for scale. We have to start it from the beginning, thinking about this as the first project, proof of concept, but then with this project, then we are increasing the amount of capital that can be deployed when we are aligning it with the policy standards, as we've seen in the case of the Indian government. Now, finally, I think it's important to realize that this is not going to work at a project-to-project level or a deal-to-deal level. The fundamental ecosystem also needs to be supported. I think some of the gentlemen also mentioned that's the macro risk. That's the systems thinking. If your policy and if your macro, your beta is not fixed, there's no amount of alpha that's going to compensate for the loss that is going to come in, right? And so I would urge all of you to look at it through that lens. There will be more conversations like this you can expect. We are going to be convening our first global conference in New Delhi in August. I would welcome all of you to join. We have a lot of these conversations planned for in New Delhi, and you can see that there's a lot of different topics that might appeal to each of you. And this is going to be our biggest delegation till date, and it's going to be at the Bharat Mandapam, one of the biggest venues that has been built by the Indian government recently. And we'll have stakeholders all across from UAE, from Saudi Arabia, from South Asia, Southeast Asia, as well as from North and Northeast Asia. So we cordially invite the Taiwan companies as well to come and join us there. And as you can see, there are lots of speakers already confirmed, and you can go on our website and see, if there are folks that you're interested in connecting, and I'll be happy to connect you to my colleague Meryl, who's actually here, and we'll help you navigate the AVPN community when you come to Delhi. Thank you. With that, I will end my presentation.